Good morning. It's so good to be with you this morning. As we begin this morning, I have a question for you, and that is, why is it that we as humans know what we should do, but we don't do it? Even though it might be something simple. Now, there's countless ways in our own lives that this is true. Think diet, right? Eat less than you burn. Simple. Or with our finances, spend less than you earn. Again, a simple concept. So why is it? Why don't we do these simple things? Is it apathy? Do we just not care? Or is it arrogance? Do we think we know better? Or is it simply laziness? Do we spend our time looking for that secret formula? Now, really, it could be any or all of these. And this is really prevalent also in our spiritual life. When I say the words Bible study, do your thoughts go to a group that meets at the church? Or do you think of your own personal time with God? And then there's the scary E word, evangelism. Now, we don't make disciples maybe because we're fearful. Or think of prayer. We think we're too busy to pray. Now, none of these have to be all that complicated, but we are really good at making excuses for why we don't do them. Let's look at prayer a little deeper, for instance. It really is simple to pray. You don't need to go to a special place like the church to pray. You don't have to wash your hands and your face in a special way to pray. And there aren't any special words to pray. It really is just a simple conversation with God. But when big decisions come, we tend to relegate prayer to a position of last resort, or to an I should have prayed position after the fact. Now, the problem with this sort of thinking is this. When I rely on my wisdom, I'm only fooling myself. But when I rely on the Lord, the battle is already won. And as we jump into Joshua chapter 9 this morning, the people of Israel have just rededicated themselves to the service and worship of the Lord. They were committing to follow his word. And we learn that this group of nomads is starting to be noticed. News of their conquests are starting to hit the nightly news around the area, and natives are starting to get frightened. We see in the first 6 verses that a group of kings assemble and they make a plan to wage war against Joshua and Israel. And out of fear, they hatch this plan for war by attacking the people of God. These kings hold to the old adage that the best defense is a good offense. And yet a different group of people, the Gibeonites, take a different tack. Instead of war, they devise a different plan. Verses 4-6 of Joshua 9, they resorted to a ruse. They went as a delegation whose donkeys were loaded with worn-out sacks and old wineskins, cracked and mended. They put worn and patched sandals on their feet and wore old clothes. All the bread of their food supply was dry and moldy. And then they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and the Israelites, "We have come from a distant country. Make a treaty with us." And as we go into verses 7-13, we find the Israelites, we find Joshua wisely asking these strangers some probing questions. In verse 7, the Israelites said to them, "But perhaps you live near us, so how can we make a treaty with you?" Now that's an interesting question. But why this question? Why does it matter if they live near? Well, there is an answer. The Lord had already given them instructions in a matter such as this. Exodus 34, Deuteronomy 20. So in Deuteronomy 20, the Lord instructs the people to attempt a peaceful takeover of the cities that are at a distance from them. The Lord says if the city agrees, then make them servants. If not, destroy the city. Now this is not the case from those who live nearby. Those cities that are nearby are to be destroyed so that the people do not become a snare for Israel. So then, really, a treaty as requested is fine with the Gibeonites if they are from a far-off land. And now what is their answer to Joshua's question? Verse 8. They say, "We are your servants." And the Gibeonites didn't answer Joshua's question, did they? Instead, they used deflection, hoping that Joshua wouldn't notice the change in subject. We go on in the last half of verse 8. But Joshua asked, "Who are you, and where do you come from?" See, Joshua is still skeptical about who these people really are. And so he asks further questions, which really is a good leadership move. Ask questions. Lots of questions. And their response we see in verse 9. They answered, "Your servants have come from a very distant country because of the fame of the Lord your God. For we have heard reports of him, all that he did in Egypt." And they go on to lay out their story. They say, "Our elders told us to take provisions and go meet these people. Make a treaty with them. Say, 'We are your servants.'" They point to their bread. "Look how moldy and dry it is. Look at our cracked wineskins. Look at our clothes and our sandals. Would we lie to you?" First it was deflection. And now it is outright deception. Now, do you find that you face these same issues today? Or maybe you recognize these in your own life. Maybe you read a headline that seems a little fishy, or a friend tells you a story that seems too good to be true. Or maybe your spouse has a hard time keeping his story straight. Well, what do? Believing them seems like the easy answer, for the sake of the relationship, but something doesn't quite add up. So what do? Do you look for more evidence, maybe? Well, that's what Joshua did. In verse 14, we're told that the Israelites sampled their provisions. Now here's the thing, it's not what Joshua and the Israelites did that becomes the issue. It's what they didn't do. Look at the last part of verse 14. The Israelites sampled their provisions, but did not inquire of the Lord. Joshua did not take the time to ask the Lord for direction with these seemingly sketchy individuals. Well, why? Did he not know how? Well, the answer is no. We actually know that Joshua was specifically taught how to inquire of the Lord. It's in Numbers 27, verse 21, where it said, "He is to stand," speaking of Joshua, "before Eleazar the priest, who will obtain decisions for him by inquiring of the Urim before the Lord." So that's not it. He knew how to do it. Was he pressed for time? Nope, they had nowhere in particular to be. Fact is, we aren't told why he didn't inquire of the Lord, but I suspect it has something to do with a feeling that we are all too familiar with. Two feelings, actually: experience and success. See, experience breeds self-proclaimed wisdom. Now, Joshua has been leading for a little while now, and there have been a number of times in which the people have attempted bigger than themselves projects. And success breeds confidence. The people crossed the Jordan River. The people marched around the walls of Jericho and they fell down. The people fought and beat the small city of Ai. See, success breeds a sense of confidence that says, "I know how this will turn out. I've got this." All of this experience and success has created a sort of wisdom in Joshua. And while it's true that Joshua and the children of Israel have had some incredible experiences and they've witnessed unbelievable successes, they seem to have forgotten who is responsible for those experiences and that success. See, none of it was anything that they had done themselves. Any success that they had experienced can only be credited to the Lord. The Lord stopped the water of the Jordan River, and the people just walked. The Lord made the walls of Jericho fall down. The people just walked. The Lord gave Ai into the hands of Israel. The people just followed his instruction. Joshua and the leaders of Israel moved ahead with this peace treaty as requested, without the Lord's direction. It says in verse 15, "Then Joshua made a treaty of peace with them to let them live, and the leaders of the assembly ratified it by oath." They relied on their own wisdom, and as we will see in a moment, they were only fooling themselves. Verse 16, 3 days after they made the treaty with the Gibeonites, the Israelites heard that they were neighbors, living near them. Now we all know that hindsight is 20/20. Their eyes have now been opened to the deception that was right in front of them and that they fell for. Israel's own wisdom has fooled them. And this puts them in a bit of a precarious position between two commands of God. He had said very clearly, don't make a treaty with those living near you. Destroy them. And the second command of God that they're sitting between is honor the name of the Lord. You know, the third commandment. They swore to keep the peace treaty with an oath made in the name of the Lord. And so here we find Joshua and Israel recognizing that the honoring of the name of the Lord was more important than the destruction of the Gibeonites. So instead of destroying them, the Israelites forced these people into serving in the house of the Lord by being water carriers and woodcutters. And in good leadership style, Joshua didn't just move on and forget what had happened. He went back to those deceivers and he pressed them for why they did what they did. And this time the Gibeonites answered truthfully. They had heard of the Lord's command to wipe out all the inhabitants of the land, and so they feared for their lives. That's why they did what they did, out of fear. So Joshua saved the Gibeonites from the Israelites, and they did not kill them. They were put to work in the service of the Lord. And with that, the Israelites would have had a daily reminder living and working amongst them of the time that they did not inquire of the Lord. And we've already seen this in our series, but when the Lord asks Israel to do something, to destroy or to take a city, he not only gives the victory ahead of time, he does the work. Think about that again for a moment. Should standing in the Jordan River with the ark of the Lord stop the flow of the river? Should simply walking around a walled city cause it to collapse? Well, no. The Lord gave the victory. The Lord gave the success by doing the difficult work. If the Israelites would have stopped to inquire what the Lord wanted them to do, the result could have been very different. Now, lest we think of Israel less and more of ourselves, I think the reasons I mentioned for Israel's lack of good sense to inquire of the Lord are still applicable for us today. And I'm sure that many of you are faithful prayer warriors. And you tell me that you are praying for the church, you're praying for the staff, you're praying for me and my family, and I am grateful for that. But I still believe that too often prayer can be more of an afterthought than a first step. So why don't we, as children of God, inquire of the Lord? And I think that the reasons why this are the same. It's arrogance, self-confidence, it's a puffed up wisdom. This is what I've done in the past, or this is what I've seen another church do, and it worked for them. It is really, really easy to let yourself get into autopilot and just get on with your day. I'd like to give you some tips this morning on inquiring of the Lord, and believe me, it looks different than it did for Joshua. So how do we inquire of the Lord? See, Joshua was given instructions about how to go about asking for the Lord's direction in any given situation. He was to go to the priest who would consult the Urim, which was a lot like casting lots or rolling the dice. When was the last time you had a big decision to make and you went to grab your little bag of dice to help you out? Or maybe the ever-popular Magic 8-Ball. Or simply flipping a coin. Now that may be appropriate for deciding who gets to receive the kickoff in a football game, but should we be making life decisions that way? And if you're in high school, you go see the guidance counselor about career choices, and does she open her desk drawer and give you a handful of dice? You know, drilling and blasting or law? And then we roll and 7. But what does that even mean? Now, it's certainly not the way that the elders of Trentside make decisions. So if that is essentially what Joshua was told to do, why not us? Why don't we make decisions this way anymore? After all, there are quite a few instances in the Bible where lots are cast, and they don't seem to be looked down on, even in the New Testament. But if you take a look at when those instances occurred, it will help us to know why this isn't the appropriate way for us to move forward. The last time we are told of God's people casting lots is right after Judas Iscariot hanged himself. And the remaining disciples cast lots for who would replace him as the 12th disciple. Notice that is prior to the coming of the Holy Spirit. And after that point, it is notable that prayer is the appropriate avenue for inquiring of the Lord. And I know what you're thinking, Dave, that's pretty obvious. Now, you'd think it was obvious, but there are a lot of people who still use anything other than prayer for answers. Now, we read again and again in the New Testament of Jesus going off to a quiet place to pray. This is Jesus. Remember, the Son of God? God himself. Even he understood the need for personal and verbal communication with his Father. How could we ever think that we don't need that? And this leads to the issue of prayerlessness in our own lives. Call it what you want, arrogance, confidence, wisdom. Whatever it is that makes you think that you don't need to pray about a situation, it's only fooling you. And on the one hand, prayer is so simple. It's just a conversation with God. No need to come to the church building. You don't have to go and prepare by washing your hands or your face or your feet. And there's no special words to say. And yet, while it is simple, we must never let our prayer get flippant. After all, it may be a simple conversation, but it's a conversation with the creator of the universe. So then let me give you a brief overview of what the Bible might tell us about as Christians about inquiring of the Lord. The first thing is this: we're instructed to pray without ceasing. 1 Thessalonians 5. Now, this doesn't mean we have our eyes closed or head bowed praying. Now, especially if you're driving your car. It does mean, however, how can you make your prayer a day-long conversation with God? Thanking him for the breath you breathe, or for the incredible sunset. Maybe asking him for help in your work or in your recreation. Now, you see it all the time, people walking around the grocery store talking to themselves, until you realize that they have an earpiece in or are actually on the phone talking to someone while they shop. Guess what? You can do that too with God, and you don't even need the earpiece. Being in a constant conversation with God will help you to default to resting in who he is, your Father. Do you remember a time when you were a child and in the middle of the night there was an especially violent thunderstorm? What was the first thing you probably did? Well, I know for me, I would have called my mom or dad. And while they sat with me and they talked with me, what happened? I felt like everything was going to be all right. See, praying without ceasing is simply keeping the lines of communication open between yourself and God. I remember a time, actually 2 times, where I experienced this in my previous career as a software developer. I worked for a company called EDS at the car plant in Oshawa, and we were responsible for the quality systems at the end of the line. Twice, I ended up having a 24-hour day because I was fixing those systems. I didn't stop to pray until many hours into the frustration. Standing there at the end of the line while the cars continued to roll off and the workers worked around us, I was relying on my own wisdom and my coworker Rob, when what I should have done was pray without ceasing. The second thing we could see the Bible telling us is ask for wisdom. In the book of James, we're instructed to ask God for wisdom if we're having our faith tested, and we need wisdom to persevere. It says he will give it to us. Proverbs 2:6 tells us where wisdom comes from. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. When you don't know, ask for wisdom. When you think you know, ask for wisdom. That was the issue with Israel. They thought they had done enough due diligence, but that only got them into trouble. The third step, I would say, is to discern the answer. Now, I don't have any single Bible passage here for you, but essentially check the whole Bible. What do you know the Bible to say? We wait on the Lord for number 2, for his wisdom, and when the answer comes, we need to discern if it is really from God or if it is just you wanting it to be from God. You can ask questions. Is it wise? Is it biblical? Is it right? You might even ask another Christian to get their input. I mean, that's why there should be a plurality of elders in a church. And once you discern the answers from God, the fourth step is this: step out in faith. When you sense that you have your answer, step out in faith. Now, not a blind faith. Blind faith would have just stepped out before taking the time to pray, kind of like the Israelites. Now, isn't it great to now have a process to follow when it comes to inquiring of the Lord? Well, it is, but see, life doesn't always work that way. We don't always have time to stop and pray, wait for an answer, discern if it's really God, and then step out in faith. And a great example of this kind of hurried prayer is the one that's thrown up quickly by Nehemiah. As the book of Nehemiah opens, he hears about the awful state of the city of Jerusalem. Walls torn down, gates off their hinges. He spends some time praying about what the Lord could do for him and his fellow Israelites while in exile. He's serving as the cupbearer to the king, and the king asks him why he's so downcast, why he's so sad. And as he answered, the king asked what he could do for him. The king said to me, "What is it you want?" Then I prayed to God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried so that I can rebuild it." All in one little sentence. Do you see that? I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king. Sometimes we do have to pray in the split second, and we have to trust the Lord to hear our prayer and to answer. Knowing how to pray, knowing when to pray, knowing what to pray for is wonderful, but in reality, this isn't the problem most of us have. We know all of the elements involved in prayer. Maybe we even know how to pray an Acts prayer, adoration, confession, thanks, and supplication. Or maybe we can recite the Lord's Prayer without thinking in multiple different versions. Now, the problem most of us have is not any of that. Our problem with prayer is us. It's me. We get in the way of our own prayer, our arrogance, our wisdom, our perceived time constraints. And that just might be the first prayer that you need to pray. Lord, I want to pray. I want to talk to you, but I keep getting in the way. Help me. And as the Puritan pastor Thomas Watson wrote hundreds of years ago, prayer delights God's ear. It melts his heart. It opens his hand. God cannot deny a praying soul. Take a minute, even now, to pray. And remember, when you rely on your own wisdom, you're fooled into thinking that you know better than God. Just